We are going to pick up here with chapter 4. Hopefully you saw the announcement. I recorded chapter 3 and I put the lecture up there on Canvas a little bit ago. And again, please make sure you go watch it. You are responsible for what's in chapter 3. Again, just because of the holiday and stuff like that, to try to get us a little bit back on pace and stuff like that. We're going to now go to chapter 4. And again, the notes should be up there on our Canvas site. Let's do that and move that over there and over there. Okay, so in chapter 4, we're going to talk about a wide variety of things. We're going to talk about obviously atoms and really sort of a couple of experiments that led to sort of the structure of the atom. We then will talk a little bit about the periodic table, and then we will get into electrons and electron configuration, and we'll finish up with some periodic trends. So a lot sort of going on in this particular chapter here, and let us get into it here. So obviously we talked about atoms and elements, and earlier I think we touched upon the fact that really atoms, which are basically made up of protons, electrons, and neutrons, are really sort of your basic unit of elements. And remember, elements, like we see on the periodic table, is as far back as we could go. The elements, again, are basically like the alphabet, as we sort of talked about. There's only so many elements, but different combinations of elements do create different compounds that have different properties. And again, it's sort of the basic unit really of an element is an atom, which again contains protons, which are positively charged, electrons negatively charged, and neutrons, which have sort of no charge associated with it. Now, when we talk about elements, they are represented by symbols. And when we write symbols, you know, there's a couple of ways that we go about sort of writing correct symbols. This is one example here for aluminum. And symbols are typically either one-letter symbols or two-letter symbols. And if they are one-letter symbol, you typically do capitalize it. If they are sort of two-letter symbols, you capitalize the first letter and not the second. Now, the names of elements do come from a wide variety of sort of sources. They may come from, you know, origins of where they were sort of discovered by people that discovered it, old sort of Latin, Greek type words, you know, and you get something, for example, like iron, you know, which has a symbol of Fe, you know, something like copper, which has a symbol of Cu, potassium, which has a symbol of K. And again, all these are really from sort of the origins from which they were discovered. We do have some that are, you know, basically from like places where they were discovered as well, like California, Berkeleum, you know, so these are places as well. Elements, again, are pure substances for which everybody else is built on. They're basically, when we get a couple of those guys together, they do make compounds, as we talked about, I think, in an earlier chapter as well. But you can break compounds back to its elements by chemical means. But as soon as you get to the elements, that is really as far back as you can go. Also, a reminder that there are certain elements which are diatomic molecules. Thing like hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, fluorine, chlorine, bromine, and iodine. These are all elements. They're all made up of the same atoms of each of these elements. There are also molecules as well, but they do come as diatomic molecules. So when we talk about hydrogen by itself, it always comes as basically hydrogen gas, two hydrogen atoms basically bound together. Oxygen, same thing, two oxygen atoms that are bound together. That is naturally how it comes. If you have something like hydrogen or oxygen by itself, it will never just be, you know, H just lonely by itself, never be just one oxygen by itself. These guys, again, do come as basically twos, if you will. And again, here are some elements and some symbols and some of the locations from which they obviously come from. You know, there's some common sort of elements that, you know, and symbols that you should start to get some familiarity with. Obviously, if you look on the periodic table, you know, these sort of elements and symbols kind of to the left, kind of up to the right is very common. These usually like a little staircase when you look at a periodic table that's sort of coming sort of down like that. So those are very common sort of elements and symbols that we come across a lot through the top. Go there. There we go. Through the top part here is a lot. Truthfully, the two bottom rows on the periodic table, we really don't get too much into it, except for uranium. It does pop up a lot. But, you know, through here and then below the staircase as well. So kind of those areas, you know, we do come across those symbols a lot. And it's good to know those, definitely when we start talking about naming, which I think might be the next chapter or so. It's really good for you to kind of know both the element symbol and the name that goes with it, because we'll talk about obviously the rules for naming. And if you're still sort of struggling with, you know, what symbol goes with what, then it does make it a little bit hard. So as I mentioned before, when we do write these symbols, they're either one letter, which is capitalized, like we see there on the bottom right, carbon, sulfur, nitrogen, hydrogen, or there are two letters like we see there, cobalt, we got silicon, neon, helium. And there really is a difference. So if you are somebody that maybe capitalizes everything that you write, you definitely don't want to do that. So for example, as we see there on the bottom, capital C, lowercase o is the element cobalt. If you write capital C, capital O, that basically means that's a carbon and an oxygen. That is carbon monoxide, which is very different. So, you know, if you are somebody that maybe capitalizes everything, you definitely don't want to do that when you're writing symbols, because you may actually be writing something that you really don't intend to do, like carbon monoxide instead of cobalt. So again, here are some of the elements and their symbols. And I would just quickly kind of looking through this table, I would say probably we do come across everybody on this table. So it'd be good stuff to be familiar with. Yeah, I would say most all of these guys here we do. And again, in case you're wondering where some of the symbols come from, again, something like iron does come from ferrum, and that's why it's Fe, cuprum, which is why copper is Cu and so forth. Gold, which is Au. That's one that we do come across a lot. Silver, which is Ag. That also is one that we come across a lot, which is silver. Tin is another one that sometimes gets people, and we do come across a lot. So Sn is tin, and that's again a common sort of symbol that we do see. Here's the rest of them here. And again, just quickly looking through these tables here, you know, this is a fairly good start of symbols and names that obviously we will come across a lot. Here's mercury, which is Hg. And again, potassium with kalium, which is why it's K. And here's our silver. Sodium as well starts with Na. And there's tin. So definitely knowing the symbols, knowing the elements are going to be very beneficial. At some point, you do need to know both. And again, really in the context of naming things, it will make your life a lot easier if you sort of know the symbol and the elements together. And again, some of our symbols that we just talked about there, gold, Au and Ag for silver. Write the correct symbols for each of the following. So iodine is a one-letter symbol, which is I. Iron is a 2-letter symbol where we would capitalize the F and lowercase the E. Magnesium is a capital M and a lowercase g. Zinc is capital Z, maybe if it writes there, and lowercase n. And lithium is a capital L and lowercase I. So again, 2-letter symbols, capital, then lowercase, and obviously capital on our 1-letter symbol. Any question on those there? So let's take a look at some of these here. What is the names of each of these? So P is phosphorus. AR is argon. Mn is manganese, not magnesium, but it's manganese. Be is beryllium, and K is potassium. As I drop that, there we go. So again, these are some common ones that we do come across a lot here in chemistry. And again, knowing the symbols and the names, really beneficial for you as we kind of go through some of these coming up chapters as well. Any questions on symbols or of the elements? So what we're going to talk about next is sort of the structure of the atom and some sort of experiments that sort of really led up to a better understanding of the atom. As I mentioned before, all elements listed on the periodic table, their basic units are atoms, which even though they're really small atoms, they have been found to have what are referred to as subatomic particles. And that is your protons, your electrons, and your neutrons. So we have these atoms, which are the basic units of elements. They're very small, and they're even made up of even smaller subatomic particles, which are referred to as neutrons, protons, and electrons. So where did sort of the beginnings, if you will, of sort of understanding the nature and the structure of an atom? There's a lot of things started with sort of philosophers, with the idea that, you know, atoms were these sort of indestructible particles. And really, a guy by the name of Dalton came up with what is referred to as Dalton's atomic theory. And it's not correct in 100% of everything that it says, but it was sort of a nice explanation of what he thought sort of atoms were and what they were responsible for. And let's take a look at some of the different parts of Dalton's atomic theory here. And we'll talk about some things that are correct and some things that maybe are not correct as much. Basically, he said all matter is made up of these tiny particles called atoms. All atoms of a given element are identical to one another, and atoms of different elements are obviously different from those. Atoms of 2 or more elements combine to form compounds. A particular compound is always made up of the same kinds of atoms and the same number of each kind of atom. You know, so for example, if you have water, H2O, it's always made up of hydrogen and oxygen. No matter where you get the water from, no matter where it comes from, it's basically made up of 2 hydrogens for every 1 oxygen. It's also sort of the same ratio. And he really said that a chemical reaction really involves the rearrangement, separation, and recombination of atoms. We don't create nor destroy atoms in a chemical reaction. And that's really what happens when we do a chemical reaction. Pretty much everything we start with, they break all the bonds, and then they basically reassemble on the other side. And as we'll talk about when we talk about something like balancing equations, that's why we do balance equations, because if we started, for example, with say 4 carbon atoms on the left-hand side of the equation, or the starting of the reaction, we should have 4 carbon atoms on the right-hand side, or the product side, when the reaction is over. The only difference is those 4 carbons may be in different locations. They may be bound to something else. And we don't ever lose anything along the way. So we have sort of that conservation of mass, and also the conservation really of the elements, that Whatever we start with in terms of elements is what we do end with. So these were the basic points of Dalton's atomic theory. There's really two parts really to his atomic theory that are sort of incorrect. He really also said that basically all matter is made up of these tiny sort of indestructible particles, which are called atoms. Atoms can be destructible because it's something like a nuclear reaction. We can actually change an element from one element to the next. The other one that's merely not so correct is this part of it. And it's this right here that all atoms of a given element are identical to one another. And that's not really correct, as we'll talk about in this chapter as well. The existence of isotopes basically disproves that. Isotopes, as we will see, are basically the exact same element, but they have different masses. And if they have different masses, that means obviously the two atoms are not identical to each other, as one weighs more than the other. Any questions on that there?
Yeah, hello, Professor Ifan.
Yeah.
Yeah, isotopes. I don't understand that. Can you break it down to me?
What were just the last part,
okay.
or?
So I was looking at a problem, right? And it gave me let's say hydrogen, for example. I still not too familiar with the periodic table, but let's say hydrogen. On the left hand side, I have a number like 25, and then the bottom I have a like 3.
Mhm.
That's an isotope, right?
That is an isotope, yeah.
Okay, yeah. How do you get those numbers?
We're actually going to talk about that in this chapter and a little bit later down the road. So we're going to talk about what those numbers are and how you actually get those. So it's actually in this chapter, I think, coming up after,
Okay.
I think, actually. So hang on, and we'll definitely get to it, I think, in this chapter.
Okay, we'll do another question. There was a problem as well. Okay, so I understand. Let's go back to hydrogen. Let's say it's 1, right? Mm-hmm. So we got proton is 1, neutron is 1, and then I think it's atomic mass that mm-hmm. changes, right?
Yeah, the atomic mass is different for each element. Yeah, we're actually going to cover all those questions in this chapter, actually. So they actually should be coming up fairly soon.
Okay, all right, cool.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Okay, so it was really believed, as I mentioned, that really atoms do contain even smaller particles, which are these subatomic particles, and they basically do have charges. We have our protons, which are positively charged, and as we will learn, they are in the nucleus. We have our neutrons, which really have no charge. They're also in the nucleus of an atom. And we have electrons, which are negatively charged and basically flying around on the outside of an atom. So an important sort of concept in terms of charges, and I think we touched upon this as well, is really the what's referred to as electrostatic attraction. And that is basically opposites attract. So things that have different charges, positive and negative things, are attracted to each other. Things that actually have the same sort of charge really do not want to be around each other. So if you get two positive guys near each other, they will kind of go away from each other. If you get two negative guys near each other, they also will go away from each other. But if you get a positive and a negative, they are attracted to one another. And that attraction actually does increase with charge. So the greater the charge of the positive and negative thing, the stronger the attraction between the two. So for example, if you had something that was a +3 charge and a -3 charge, they would be attracted to each other a lot stronger than something that was +1 and -1. So a lot of early work went into really exploring electrons, and a lot of that work was done by a guy named Thomson. Thomson used what is referred to as a Crt tube, cathode ray tube, which is basically a stream of electrons, and it has like an electrical field. So it has kind of like a negative plate, a positive plate, and this beam of negatively charged electrons heading towards the positive side here. You might be familiar with Crt tubes. If you've ever seen maybe an older TV, ones that have like the big back, not flat screens or anything like that. old ones they used to have like on the floor, those type of TVs. Those picture tubes were CRT tubes. Also older computer monitors, if you ever seen one of those that have kind of like the big back, again, not flat screen or anything like that. Those also were CRT tubes. So Thomson did a lot of work, and with that CRT tubes, and a guy by the name of Milligan also did a lot of work. And really what they were able to do was really discover, what was the mass of an electron. And the mass of an electron was something like 9.09 times 10 to the minus 28 grams, which is a very small mass. And around this time, Thomson actually proposed sort of the earliest version of the model of an atom, which was he felt that the atom was basically the sphere of positive charge. So it's just a big old sphere of positive charge, and embedded inside the atom were these electrons. And he referred to that as the plum pudding model of the atom. And that's like a dessert. So it's like a pudding with raisins in there. So he felt the pudding part was sort of the positive charge that was spread out. The raisins were basically the electrons. And he felt that most of the mass of the atom was really made up of those electrons. And this was sort of a fairly accepted version of the model of the atom for a good period of time, until really the next big experiment came through, and that was Rutherford's gold foil experiment. And Rutherford's gold foil experiment, Rutherford basically shot what are referred to as alpha particles. Alpha particles are positively charged radioactive particles. And he basically shot these alpha particles at pieces of gold foil and other metals. And he was going off the assumption of sort of the plum pudding model, where we're shooting something that is positively charged at a big sphere positively charged. And what he expected to happen was he expected that these guys would come through and there would be a little bit of deflection as they came through, right? Positive and positive, but they're heavy, they're moving fast. They kind of expected these particles really to, kind of bang through. Kind of like, for example, if you held like a piece of paper up really tight on both sides and you like shot a pen or something at it, it probably would poke through the paper, but there will be a little deflection as you sort of poke through the paper. And that's really what they expected to happen based on the plum pudding model. And they were actually really surprised when they did this experiment, and they had sort of a detection screen here so you can see where the alpha particles, these were the alpha particles being shot at pieces of gold foil. And what they really saw was, for a vast majority of them, they just went up right on through undeflected. So most of the alpha particles went through undeflected. But every so often, they did see something that was really interesting. They would see these alpha particles bounce off at these really large angles. So every so often, it would bounce off at large angles. So this was really surprising to them, because they basically had to go, well, I don't think this is correct. This is not such a good model. And they had to basically base the model of the atom based on what they observed. And what they observed was most of them went through with no problem. And what that meant was there was a lot of empty space. And most of the atom is made up of empty space. And that's what accounts for all those kind of alpha particles just sailing through no problem. But they did see those guys bounce off at really large angles. And since those guys were positively charged or heavy, they're moving fast, the only thing that can make those alpha particles bounce off at these really large angles is it had to hit something that was very, very positively charged. So they said that basically there is a dense positive core known as the nucleus in the atom, and that's what accounted for those alpha particles that basically bounced off at these really large angles. They had to hit something that was very, very positive. And they've also felt that most of the mass of the atom was empty, was the nucleus. I'm sorry, was the nucleus. So later on, there's a lot of things that were sort of filled in, but basically within the empty space is where our electrons are traveling around. And by the way, electrons do not travel in pretty circles. They don't travel in orbits. They actually travel pretty randomly about the nucleus. So you got like the nucleus in the middle, and you got the electrons traveling in a very random sort of pattern. The dense core of the nucleus basically contains protons that was later found, which are positively charged. And we also have our neutrons, which were discovered like in 1936, which has no charge. And the mass of a proton and a neutron, they're both about 1,800 times heavier than any electron. So that also makes sense that most of the mass of the atom was thought to be the nucleus, because within the nucleus we have protons and neutrons, and actually each of them individually are about 1,800 times heavier than any electron that you have there. In terms of mass, the neutron is actually the heaviest out of all of them. It's the heaviest, just barely. It just barely inches out the proton, which is almost close in terms of mass, and way less mass than all of them are an electron. Is the lightest of those three particles. So here's sort of an idea. An atom consists of protons and neutrons within the nucleus, and that large empty space is where our electrons are flying around. Again, our nucleus is really positively charged because of the protons, and within that empty space is where we see those electrons really flying around. So basically, structure of the atom, we have a nucleus where we have our protons and neutrons, electrons, again, randomly flying around basically the nucleus. Is there attraction between the electrons and the nucleus? And the answer is yes. The electrons are negatively charged. The nucleus is basically positively charged. And there is an attraction between those two. It also accounts for, as we'll talk about when we talk about bonding, why certain electrons are involved in bonding and certain ones are not involved in bonding, depending on really their location to the nucleus. Any question on the structure of an atom? So protons positively charged, found in the nucleus, neutrons no charge, found in the nucleus, and electrons flying around in that empty space in a random pattern. And again, the heaviest of those three particles being the neutron, proton very, very close to it, and our electron much, much lighter than those guys. Any questions on any of that there?
Yeah, Professor Efron. So in any case, would the atom change, or the atom will always be a positive proton, zero neutrons, and negative electrons?
Is your question, is that always the charge for those particles? Is that we're asking, the protons, neutrons, and electrons?
Yeah, would those ever change in the atom?
They won't change in terms of, if you have a proton, it's always going to be positively one charge. If you have an electron, it will always be negatively one charge. And if you have a neutron, it really will have no charge. What does change is, depending on the element, how many protons, electrons, and neutrons somebody has. If you're just strictly talking about, the charge on a proton, it will always be positive one, electron will always be negative one, and the neutron will always be no charge.
So you apply the atom, let's say, going back to the example, hydrogen, because the element's one, right? You apply the atom to the element, and if it's one, it'll just be one. But if it's three, how does that work together? How do you put that together?
Yeah, so the atom is really just a representation, the basic representation of an element, and every element will have a different number of protons. And when we get into sort of your earlier question, we'll figure out, the relationship between those. But basically, the number of protons that you have basically determines what element you're talking about. So if you're talking about hydrogen will always have one proton no matter what the deal is. If you have something with two protons, it is no longer hydrogen. It will only be helium. So it's actually the protons which are really what's important in terms of what element you're talking about.
Oh, that's cool. Okay. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Other questions? Okay, then let us talk a little bit about atomic mass unit and the mass of an atom. Obviously, atomic mass unit is sometimes abbreviated as AMU, as we see here. And it has a mass equal to really the mass of a carbon-12 isotope. And a proton has a mass of 1.007 AMU, a neutron 1.008, so very, very close in terms of their mass, and then 0.0055 AMU. Most of the time, people will use sort of the grams version of sort of what it is. And for example, these guys are times 10 to the minus 24 grams, so much heavier than a electron, as we see here. So again, this is what we sort of see in terms of our charges and the masses of each of these guys. And again, you can see the neutron is just heavier than the proton. They're very, very close in terms of their mass, and followed far behind, about 1,800 times lighter is our electron, as we go around sort of the structure of the atom. Now, every single element will have protons, electrons, and neutrons, except for hydrogen. Hydrogen has one proton and one electron and no neutrons. So hydrogen is kind of special in certain cases, which is why it's kind of to the left there of the periodic table. But hydrogen is the only element that really doesn't have a neutron. It has a proton and electron, but all other elements will have all those guys, a proton, electron, and a neutron. Which of the following subatomic particles fits in each of the descriptions? Found outside the nucleus, that should be our electron. Has a positive charge, that should be our proton. And has mass but no charge, that would obviously be our neutron in that particular case.
Professor Ephron?
Yes.
Can you go back to the slide?
Yeah.
One before this one?
Other one for this one, or?
Okay, so the AMU, is there a certain way to get the AMU, or is that's just the standard?
Yeah, so we'll actually talk a little bit more about it a little bit later when we talk about atomic mass. But basically, if you look on the periodic table, for example,
I'm looking at it right now.
Yeah, and you look at underneath the symbol for everybody, for example, carbon, you'll see like a number like 12.01, and that's what's known as the atomic mass. And that's usually one way that we use that number is that's how many AMU there are in an atom of that. So there would be 12.01 AMU and one atom for carbon 12. And it's just AMU is really just sort of a unit like grams, for example, or kilograms or something like that. It's just a way of referencing sort of the mass. And there actually is a conversion between AMU and grams. And so it's just sort of a unit kind of similar to like a unit of grams or something like that they use for the atomic mass of these guys. And the atomic masses we'll talk about, it's basically based off of like a carbon-12 isotope. And that's sort of where these numbers sort of come from. And we'll talk about, where they come from here in this chapter as well.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. So which of the following is true or false? The mass of an electron is greater than the mass of a proton. That is false. The electron is actually the lightest of all of them. Protons have positive charge. Electrons have negative charge. That is true. And the nucleus of an atom contains only protons and neutrons. That is true as well. So again, protons and neutrons within the nucleus, electrons basically flying about. And although, the atom is really small, the nucleus is actually very, very small in comparison to the size of the atom. Like you think of the atom like as like a football field, and like the nucleus would be like a marble, like on the 50-yard line. is relatively small. This is basically our nucleus here, where we have our protons and neutrons. This you might be able to pick up on your screen. It's kind of like a blue smear, if you will. It's kind of darker blue here. And then it kind of gets lighter blue and lighter blue. And that's really the empty space of an atom. And that's where we have our electrons basically flying around within that sort of space. And when we see something like that, like this sort of darker blue color to lighter blue, sometimes it's like a dark red color to a lighter red color. These are what sometimes referred to as probability maps, which means in the darker color region, there's a higher probability of finding an electron. And as you kind of fan out in those lighter regions, there is a lower probability of finding an electron. If you think about where kind of the lighter region is, it's kind of far away from the nucleus, right? So, there's a pretty good shot of finding an electron near the nucleus, but as you sort of travel from the nucleus at some distance, the probability of finding an electron sort of flying around does lessen. Any questions? Yeah.
Can you go back to the slide?
Yeah, this one?
Okay, so around the atom are the electrons flying around, the electron cloud, right?
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is keeping those electrons around the nucleus?
It's the basic attraction that we see a lot in chemistry. And it's really just this basic electrostatic attraction, which is a fancy way of saying positive and negative things are attracted to each other. So right there, dead in the middle, if you will, of an atom, you have that really positive nucleus because it has protons in there. And you have these negatively flying around guys, which are electrons. So there is definitely an attraction between those two. So it's almost like, the string that kind of holds the electron there. But, if you like hold one end of a string and just kind of flops around all over the place, and that's sort of how the electrons move around, is just flopping around, but it's sort of anchored, if you will, kind of to the nucleus because of that positive charge. So it doesn't allow all the electrons perhaps to just kind of fly away and leave the atom, because there is that sort of attraction that kind of binds it to the nucleus.
Okay, understood. Does that also mean that some electrons could fly off sometimes?
They can, and that's the basis of bonding. For example, in ionic bonding, as we'll talk about when we get there, in ionic bonding, that's exactly sort of what happens. And it's really, as I was kind of brushing over here, these kind of further away electrons. These electrons which are further away from the nucleus, they're not held as tightly, and they're a lot easier for them to sort of leave, if you will. And that's sort of where the electrons, those are what are referred to as valence electrons, as we'll talk about. And those are the ones that really, are able to leave, because although they are still attracted to the nucleus, they're just kind of too far away to really feel the really full brunt of the positive charge, as opposed to electrons, which are like right next to it or near it. Like say this was an electron, this guy right here would be feeling like the full brunt of that positive charge. And let's just say it had like 10 protons. It would be feeling like a plus 10 charge, and this electron would be held really, really tight. If you get an electron kind of further away, A is further away, and there's also other electrons in the way, and it doesn't feel that plus 10 charge. Maybe it feels only like a plus 3 charge. And that means it's a lot easier to allow that electron to leave. And that's sort of the basis of what sort of happens in ionic bonding. And we'll definitely get to that when we get there. Yeah. Other questions? You're welcome. Other questions? Okay. All right, so now let's get, I think, to the question that was sort of asked a little bit earlier, where does those numbers come from next to the symbols and stuff like that. So we're going to talk about atomic number, mass number, and isotopes, and really what those things are. So really, as we've been talking about, if you think about sort of the structure of the atom, that the electrons are on the outside, it makes sense that a lot of the chemistry basically comes from electrons interacting with one another. It's really, if you think about it, sort of the first two things that kind of come in contact with each other, electrons on one, electrons on the other. And they're really the basis of all bonding is, and all chemical reactions are simply just electrons and bonds being broken. And that's really the basis of everything that happens. So the first really important sort of aspect of it was known as the atomic number. The atomic number is sometimes abbreviated with a Z, and it is the number of protons in the nucleus of an atom. So the actual definition of atomic number is actually just the number of protons that you have in an atom. If you have a neutral atom, that means that all the positive charges and all the negative charges need to cancel each other out. And if you think about really an atom, it's really only made up of three things. It's made up of a proton that's positively charged. It's made up of electrons that are negatively charged, and it's made up of neutrons that have no charge. So if I know the atomic number, which is the number of protons, which are the positive charges, and the thing is neutral, that means I should have an equal number of electrons. But it's a really important distinction that the actual definition of atomic number. So if you had a question that said, hey, what is the definition of atomic number? It is just the number of protons. Second to that, though, is if it is neutral, it will also tell you the number of electrons that are present. For example, if we go to the periodic table and you look at something like hydrogen, the atomic number is found right above the symbol, and hydrogen's atomic number is 1. That means that hydrogen has 1 proton. If you look on the periodic table there for nitrogen, N, and it will have a 7. That 7 is the atomic number of nitrogen, which means if it's a neutral nitrogen atom, it should have 7 protons, and to balance it out, it would have 7 electrons. So 7 positive guys, protons, and 7 negative electrons would balance each other out. If you look all across the periodic table, if you look at all the symbols that you see there, all the way across, you look at all the top numbers that are on top of the symbols, you will never see a number that repeats. So as I was mentioning earlier, it is actually the number of protons, which is the atomic number, that basically tells you what element you're dealing with. So if I said, hey, I have 10 protons, I could go to the periodic table and find number 10, and it probably will say neon underneath it. And neon would have 10 protons and also would have 10 electrons if it was neutral. Would I ever have a nitrogen atom that has 3 protons? And the answer is no, because if you have 3 protons and you look on the periodic table, number 3 on top is lithium. So if you only have 3 protons or an atomic number of 3, you are talking about lithium. If you have 7 protons or atomic number is 7, you are talking about nitrogen. So in terms of those 3 subatomic particles, protons, electrons, neutrons, it is the protons that are really important in determining what element you're talking about. If you by some chance change the number of protons or the atomic number, then you are no longer talking about the same element. You're talking about a different element. Any questions on that there? Another really important number is the mass number, which is abbreviated with an A. And the mass number is the total number of protons and neutrons that you have in an atom. So if we take those 2 numbers that we just talked about, the mass number, which is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons, and we take the atomic number, which is the number of protons, and we actually subtract those 2, subtract the mass number from the atomic number, we are left with the number of neutrons. So if you take the mass number minus the atomic number, you will end up with the number of neutrons. As I mentioned before, except for hydrogen, which has only a proton and electron and no neutrons, every single element has protons, electrons, and neutrons. Now, really important thing is this: when you're asked to give the number of protons, the number of electrons, the number of neutrons, or you're asked to give the atomic number or the mass number, those all should be positive whole numbers. So they all should be positive whole numbers. So the question may be, is that number on the bottom the mass number? And the answer is no, it is not the mass number. So it is the atomic number, atomic mass, as we talked about earlier, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in just a second, but it is actually the atomic mass. So one way you can remember that is really from this definition here. When you do the mass number, the atomic number, protons, electrons, neutrons, they need to be whole number. And if you sort of scour the periodic table there, pretty much every single element there on the bottom is really not a whole number. They're all decimal type numbers. The reason people really screw it up a lot of times is the mass number and the atomic mass are numbers that are very similar to each other. So it is actually only the atomic number, the number of protons that you can find on the periodic table. That is the number above the symbol. The mass number is not found on the periodic table, but it can be calculated. You'll be given enough information really to calculate those things. Any questions on that there? So isotopes, as we talked about, isotopes, as we talked about earlier, are really the same element, but they do have different numbers of neutrons, which means they do have different masses. And to answer sort of an earlier question, a very common way that we write symbols for isotopes is what we see on the bottom. We do the symbol, the chemical symbol. Top left goes the mass number. Bottom left goes the atomic number. So earlier, I think this question was asked, where do these numbers come from here? And that's where these numbers come from. Top left is the mass number. Bottom left is the atomic number. For example, hydrogen here has 1 proton and no neutrons. Deuterium, which is actually sometimes referred to as heavy hydrogen, has 1 proton, 1 neutron. Tritium is really the radioactive version of hydrogen, has 1 proton and 2 neutrons. If we were going to write the symbols and everything for each of these isotopes, I would start with hydrogen. And if I wasn't sure what the symbol was, I see 1 proton. That is my atomic number. And I would go to the periodic table and I would find number 1 and I would see hydrogen there. And I would write then hydrogen. Atomic number should go bottom left. On the top should go mass number, which is number of protons plus neutrons. So 1 proton, 0 neutrons gives me a mass number up on top. If you take the top number minus the bottom number, that gives you 0, which is your number of neutrons. And that would be the correct symbol for hydrogen. Now, if we come to deuterium, even though it doesn't say hydrogen, we see that it has 1 proton, which means the atomic number is 1, which again, if you weren't sure who that was, which you might not be from that name, you would go 1 proton, atomic number 1, it is still hydrogen. So we would still use the same symbol. We would put 1 on the bottom for the atomic number. But for deuterium, there is 1 proton and 1 neutron, which means the mass number would be 1 plus 1, which would be 2. And that would be the symbol for deuterium. We could also do it for tritium. Again, if you weren't sure, that is actually hydrogen. Right here will tell you that. We have, again, 1 proton, which means when we go to the periodic table, we will see number 1. And that should also tell us that the symbol we should use is H. Also has 1 for the atomic number. 1 proton and 2 neutrons gives us 3 for the mass number. And these are the 3 symbols for hydrogen, deuterium, and tritium, but they are all really hydrogen because they all have 1 for the atomic number, which means they really are all hydrogen in terms of their elements. Any questions on that there? Now, another way sometimes you'll see isotopes written, for example, is Cu, say copper 64. And you might be wondering, what is this number? Well, I know if I go to the periodic table and look up copper, up on top, I think it still says 29, I hope. And I know that 29 is the atomic number, which means clearly that is not the atomic number, but that is the mass number. And that's a common way sometimes isotope symbols are written. So you'll sometimes see it that way. And if we were to turn that into sort of this format, we would do Cu, atomic number from the periodic table would go on the bottom, mass number would go up on top, And how many neutrons would that copper atom have? Take a second and tell me how many neutrons would that copper atom have?
Professor.
Yes.
So for tritium and deuterium, are those found in nature, or is that like a man-made?
Some are found in nature. Some isotopes are found in nature. Some isotopes are sort of mannish made, if you will. For example, copper 64. There's like copper 68, copper 69. So some of them are man-made. Some isotopes, and they're actually made like you might anticipate. They actually just shoot particles at like stable elements or atoms of it, and they become sort of unstable and stuff like that. So some are naturally made for all the elements, and there's naturally occurring isotopes, and there's some that are sort of man-made. Other questions on that? So to find the number of neutrons, remember, basically we take the mass number minus the atomic number. And in this case, that would be mass number on top. So that'd be 64 minus 29. I believe that's 35 neutrons. Question on that there.
Professor, is that always the rule?
Is that always, I'm sorry,
Is that always the rule to get the
number of neutrons?
yes.
Yeah, so you always do take the mass number minus the atomic number. So basically mass number minus number of protons. Other questions on that?
Thank you.
You're welcome. So why don't you try some here for each of these, figure out how many protons, electrons, and neutrons there are in each of them. So take a moment or two and then we'll talk about it. So let's take a look and kind of see how we're doing. So remember, top number here is our mass number. And again, that is basically the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. Bottom number here is really our number of protons, which is our atomic number. So in this particular case, by the way, this is cobalt. Right here from this number, we know that it has 27 protons, which are positively charged. This guy is neutral, and the reason we know it's neutral is because if it did have a charge, it would be written here. So, if it did have a charge, positive, negative, whatever it may be, we would see something written there. Because we actually don't see anything written there, we could assume that it's neutral, which means in order to balance out my 27 positive charges for my protons, I would need 27 electrons to balance it out. Again, basically 27 positive charges, 27 negative charges leaves you a 0 overall charge. Is neutral in that case. The number of neutrons in this case would be our mass number, which is our top number, minus our bottom number, which is our atomic number. And that looks like 33 in that case. Any questions on those guys there? That one. Coming down here to the next one, this is chlorine. So again, we see nothing written here, so we could assume it's neutral. Best place to start would be right here. That's 17. That implies that's the atomic number. That means that there are 17 protons. Again, because there's no charge, we should then also have an equal number of electrons to balance it out. Again, 17 positives, 17 negatives give us no charge overall. And again, our number of neutrons being our mass number, which is 37 in this case, minus our atomic number, which is 17. That looks like a 20 in terms of neutrons. Any questions on that one there? And lastly, here we have U, which is uranium. So we again see pretty much nothing there, which means it is neutral. Starting again at the atomic number, which is a good place. That is 92 protons, that means. Again, because there's no charge, that should also mean equal number of electrons. And in this case, number of neutrons would be 238 mass number minus bottom number. And that's a lot. We'll go with 146 and hope for the best there. Any questions on how to determine protons, electrons, and neutrons here? Again, they're all whole numbers, no decimals, no half a proton, half an electron. Everything sort of balances out. All right, I think they agree. That's good. So let's take a look at this one. Krypton atom has 48 neutrons. So what we would want to do is look on the periodic table for krypton. And when we do, it is Kr. When you look at the periodic table, you should then look above the symbol, and that will give us our atomic number. And that number should go on the bottom left. And if we did that, that would be 36. And in this case, 36 protons plus 48 neutrons gives us 84, which is the mass number that should go up on top. Any questions on that one there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. Can you explain that again?
Yeah. So basically, in this case, they told us it's krypton and it has 48 neutrons. So if you weren't sure what the atomic number would be, you would want to go to the periodic table, find the symbol for krypton. And when you do, above that symbol should be a 36 on the periodic table. And that means that that is, as we've been talking about, the atomic number. And that atomic number, right, should end up bottom left of the symbol. That 36, which is the atomic number, also tells us that is the number of protons there are, which means that krypton here has 36 protons. And remember that the mass number is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. So if it has 36 protons, they told us in the problem that it had 48 neutrons. When you add those together, that gives us a mass number of 84, which would end up at the top left. And that would be the correct way to write that symbol.
Mass number is protons plus the neutrons, right?
That is exactly it. Yep. And remember, again, as we've been talking about, the number that you see on the bottom is not the mass number. So that's not the mass number. You have to calculate it based on the numbers that are given to you. Other questions on that?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Professor, I had a question because on the periodic table, the mass is sometimes not the same as what the problems is. When I look at the periodic table, like on the lab, some of them work. Are you running? Does that mean that they're running off the mass?
No, so we're going to be very clear that the number that you see on the bottom, I'm assuming you're talking about the number that you see on the bottom of the periodic table, right?
Yes.
Like carbon's 12.01 or something like that, right? And this number here is not the mass number. And the way you can remember that is what we were just talking about a couple of slides back. When you calculate the mass number, the atomic number, the protons, electrons, neutrons, all of those numbers should always be positive whole numbers. And if you look at all the numbers that are on the bottom of those symbols on the periodic table, they're pretty much not whole numbers. So those are not the mass number. They are what are referred to as the atomic mass, which is different.
Okay.
Mass number. So they are the atomic mass. And what confuses people is kind of like what your question was, you know, the number looks very close to the mass number, right? It looks almost like it's the same number.
Yes.
And they're all based off of basically the mass of protons, electrons, neutrons. But when you're asked to write the mass number or calculate the mass number, you should never take that number on the periodic table on the bottom, because it's really not the mass number. It's just really the atomic number. But the confusion is it's a very close number a lot of times. But the way you calculate the mass number is like we did here in this particular one. It will somehow give you the neutrons or something like that. And you would take the neutrons plus the protons to get that number.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions?
Yes, Professor, I have a question regarding the slide before.
The slide before?
Yes. When you were getting the numbers for the protons and the electrons, and you said that there was no charge. Does that mean the electrons would be the same number of protons?
They would have to be. So basically within an atom, there's only three things. There's protons, which are positively charged. There's electrons, which are negatively charged.
Okay.
And then there's neutrons, which have no charge. So in order for something to be neutral, it basically means that all the positive charges, which in the case of an atom is basically all the protons, would have to equal exactly the negative charges in an atom, which are basically the electrons. So when something is neutral and has no charge, the number of protons, which is the atomic number, will equal the number of electrons.
Okay.
But an important part of that, though, is, as I said earlier, the actual definition, though, again, if somebody just asks you straight, like, what is the definition of atomic number? The actual definition is just protons. But second to that, it does tell you how many electrons there would be if the atom was neutral.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So we're not giving the mass number. How do we find the neutrons?
So if you're not given the mass number, how would you find the neutrons?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you would probably have to be given the mass number to figure out the number of neutrons. So you would, in these problems, be given the mass number. If not, it would be a problem like this where you're not given the mass number, but they give you the neutrons and ask you to find the mass number. So those are the two ways that you would probably have that. There would be no way for you to really figure out the mass number if you were not given the number of neutrons, and vice versa. Obviously, if you weren't given the number of neutrons, you can't get the mass number, and if you don't have the mass number, you really can't get the number of neutrons. So they do have to give you one of those pieces of information, either mass number or neutrons, in these type of problems. Otherwise, you can't do that. The only number for sure that you could just find by yourself would be on the periodic table, the atomic number. That's really the only one you can find. Other questions?
So just the protons and the neutrons? No, just the protons, right?
That you can find on the periodic table?
Yeah, so just the protons.
Just
Okay.
the atomic number. So this number up here on top of the symbol is really the only thing that you could find for sure off of the periodic table in relationship to what we're doing, which would be the number of protons. Other questions? Then let's take a look at nitrogen here. So again, if we want to write the symbol with the mass number and atomic number, we would then go to the periodic table. And again, we should look up nitrogen, which hopefully we know is N. We should find the number that's on top. And again, as we were just talking about, this is really the only number that we could use in this case for this calculation. That again is our atomic number. That is the number of protons. So we do know that it does have 7 protons. So this guy would then have 7, I guess, protons. We do it that way. And what that means is the symbol should be N with a 7 on the bottom. And now that we know the protons and they gave us the neutrons, we could add those together for the mass number, which would be 6 plus 7 is 13. And that should go on top left of our symbol. And that would be the proper symbol there. 13 from the 6 neutrons and 7 protons. Atomic number is 7 for the 7 protons there are in nitrogen. Question on that one there. All right, why don't you take a second here and see what you come up with. Write the symbol with the mass number and atomic number for iron that has a mass number of 56. Also figure out how many protons, electrons, and neutrons there are. Okay, let's take a look at this one here. So again, we have iron. In this case, they actually gave us the mass number. So we would want to go to the periodic table and figure out what is iron's symbol. Hopefully you know at some point that iron symbol is Fe. Again, as we've been talking about, really the only piece of information we could get from there is the number that comes up on top, and I hope that's still 26. That 26 is the atomic number, which is the number of protons. And that means that really in this case, we should have Fe 56 on top, which would be our number, our mass number, and 26 on the bottom, which would be our atomic number. And if we do that, maybe if we do that, there we go. And that means that if we want to figure out what's going on in terms of protons, electrons, and neutrons, 26 is our atomic number, which would be the number of protons. Protons, there we go. And also 26 would be the number of electrons, as it is neutral. And to find our number of neutrons, we take our mass number, which was 56, minus our atomic number, which was 26, and we end up with 30 neutrons in this particular case. Any questions on how to figure out protons, electrons, neutrons, mass number, atomic number? Okay. Now, what happens if, say, something did have a charge, for example? If something did have a charge, those are what are known as ions, right? These are things with charges. There's really two types. There's a cation, which is positively charged. There's an anion, which is negatively charged. So let's just grab one of these guys here that we just did. Let's do nitrogen there. We'll just take our nitrogen. And we had 13, I think, and 7. And let's just say we gave it a -3 charge. Now, in this particular case, we'll rewrite what we had earlier. This is nitrogen with no charge, and that was 7 protons, 7 electrons, and 6 neutrons, right? In this particular case, it has still 7 protons because the atomic number is still 7. Neutrons, it has still 13 minus 7, which is 6. But how many electrons does it have in this case? And in terms of electrons, it actually has 10 electrons in this case. And that's because if I take 10 negatives from electrons and I only have 7 positive charges, that leaves me a -3 left over. And that is where the charge comes from. So what is the difference between nitrogen with a -3 charge and nitrogen with no charge? What do we see is it is actually the electrons that change. And if we look at the electrons in the neutral guy, which was 7, and we look at the electrons here in the -3 guy, it is 10. So first off, when you see it charged as negative, that means it's an anion, and it means that it gained electrons. How many electrons did it gain? It started at 7, ended at 10. Surprisingly enough, it gained the number. It gained 3 electrons. So when you see a charge like -3, what that indicates is that particular guy gained electrons because it's negatively charged. And the number tells you how many electrons it gained from the neutral. Why would I not change the number of protons? If I change the number of protons, right, I'm now not talking about nitrogen because nitrogen has 7 and it can only have 7 protons. So when we do get something with a charge, it's only the electrons that change. Same thing if we look at like the iron example, it was 56 and 26 in iron. And this guy with no charge had 26 protons, a matching number of electrons, and again, neutrons was 30. If we take that iron exact deal, but give it a +2 charge, now let's talk about what's happening here. Still's got to be 26 protons because it's still iron. Still has 56 minus 26 and 30 neutrons. But how many electrons does it have in this case? It now has 24 electrons. 26 positive charges, 24 negative charges, leaves me a +2 charge left over. And that is where the charge came from. That is a cation. And what happened between the neutral guy, which had 26 electrons, and the guy with a positive charge? It went from 26 electrons to 24 electrons. And something with a positive charge means that it has lost electrons. How many did it lose? It lost 2, which is equal to the charge. So when you actually see something with a positive charge, it should tell you that it's a cation and that it lost electrons, and whatever the charge is how many electrons it lost. So if you happen to come across something that has a charge, the only thing that should change when you're calculating protons, electrons, and neutrons is the number of electrons. Any questions on that? Okay, so that leads us to isotopes. The chemical properties of elements are really determined by protons and electrons in an atom. Neutrons really don't play a part in normal chemical reactions. So really nice thing about isotopes sometimes is there's a lot of radioactive versions of elements. And for example, if you use a radioactive version of an element, you can follow what's happening with it. So for example, I used to do experiments where I used a radioactive version of copper. And because the radioactive version of copper and regular copper, like in the body, basically behaves the same way, you could use like a radioactive version of it and really just follow where the copper goes, for example, in a pathway by following where the radioactivity is. So the nice thing about isotopes is they do basically behave exactly like each other, because it's really the protons and electrons that are important in terms of how they behave. Any questions on atomic number, mass number, protons, electrons, neutrons? Okay, then what we're going to talk about now is actually that number that's on the bottom that we keep coming back to in terms of the periodic table and underneath the symbol, and that is atomic mass. So again, as we mentioned a number of times today, that number on the bottom here is the atomic mass. Again, not the mass number, but it is the atomic mass. And basically the atomic mass is basically pertaining to the M number of protons, electrons, and neutrons there are. But obviously an atom is extremely small. You can't really pick it up and just like plop it down on a scale and stuff like that. So when we cannot really measure a particular item in chemistry or in science, a lot of times what people do is they basically come up with a sort of standard to compare everybody to. And for atomic mass, they came up with an isotope of carbon, which is the carbon 12 isotope, which has a mass of exactly 12 AMU. So they basically chose this guy because it had like 6 protons and 6 electrons and all those things, neutrons, and it has a mass of exactly 12 AMU. And they basically compared everybody to it. They basically said, well, hydrogen is only like 8% as massive as a carbon 12 isotope. So they did a small little calculation where they took 8.4%, moved the decimal point 2 places to the left, are divided by 100, times it by 12, and we get this sort of number that we see underneath hydrogen, which is 1.00 AMU. Again, AMU is atomic mass unit, kind of as I was mentioning earlier, kind of like a unit like grams, not exactly the same, but it represents sort of the atomic mass. Similar calculations were done for oxygen, iron, and everybody else listed on the periodic table. Now, you may be wondering, if they chose a carbon 12 isotope that has a mass of 12 AMU, why, when you look at carbon on the periodic table, does it say 12.01 on the bottom? And that is because what we actually see on the periodic table are what are referred to as average atomic masses. Even though nobody really calls them average atomic masses, they're actually average atomic masses of basically all the naturally occurring isotopes for that particular element. So earlier, I think somebody asked about, are these isotopes sort of naturally occurring or man-made? And the answer is both. But there are, for every element, some isotopes that are sort of naturally occurring. And they do come in different percentages, or relative abundance is sometimes referred to. And there is a formula that we could use to calculate the atomic mass in AMU. And we basically take the percent, and this is what is sometimes referred to as the percent abundance or relative abundance, times the atomic mass of the first isotope. And then we add it to the percentage times the atomic mass of the next isotope. Then we kind of continue that pattern. So percent abundance, again, somewhere they'll say percent abundance, relative abundance. When we think about all the naturally occurring isotopes for a particular element, we should want the percentages to add up to 100%. Otherwise, we would be missing an isotope, right? If you don't have 100% of something, you're missing somebody. So we do want to make sure that our isotopes sort of add up to it. So for example, here, the carbon is basically two naturally occurring isotopes, carbon 12 isotope and the carbon 13 isotope. Carbon 12 isotope has a mass of 12.00 AMU. Carbon 13 has a mass of 13.003. The carbon 12 isotope occurs about 98% of the time, 99% of the time. The carbon 13 occurs at about 1.1% of the time. So we could use the formula I just did, which is we would take our first percentage, divide it by 100 or move the decimal point, and you would get 0.9897. And that's what you get when you convert the percentage into a decimal. You would times it by 12. And that's our first isotope, basically. We then would add it, and that's something people mess up on. They want to always multiply here, but you're actually going to be adding it to the percentage of our second isotope, which is 1.11%. We also need to convert that into a decimal. So you can either move the decimal point or you can divide it by 100 if you want. And we would then times that by the mass of that isotope, which is 13.003 AMU. If you do that math, you end up with 12.01. In reality, I think you actually end up with 12.02, but you end up with some number like that. And if you look again underneath carbon on the periodic table, we do see 12.01. So what we actually see on the periodic table are the naturally occurring isotopes for a particular element and the average atomic mass. And again, most people don't really call it average atomic mass. They do just call it the atomic mass. Question on that calculation there. And again,
yeah, Professor.
Yeah, go ahead.
Professor Ifan, I'm a little mixed up on the abundance percentage.
Yeah. So that's just basically the percentage at which they occur sort of in nature. So as we see, if we just look at these two isotopes of carbon, basically almost about 99% of the time, if you found a carbon isotope, it would probably be the carbon 12 isotope. And about 1% of the time, it would be the carbon 13 isotope. So it's basically sort of the relative abundance, or basically the percentage of which it is found in nature, I guess is one way of looking at it. And again, you can see by just the difference in the percentages, pretty much most of the carbon atom isotopes that you would find would be the carbon 12 isotopes as it occurs, as you can see, almost 99% of the time. And every 1% of the time, you would find a carbon 13 isotope. Now, because they are percentages and you want to make sure that you have all of the naturally occurring isotopes, it's always a good idea to take all the percentages here and just kind of give it a quick add. And they should add up to about 100%, not perfectly, but it should be somewhere near 100%. And then you know you pretty much have all the naturally occurring isotopes. So that's what the relative abundance is. It basically just tells you, you know, out of 100%, basically this percentage of the time is you get this isotope, and the other percentage of time you get the other isotope. Other questions on that?
Yeah. So would the abundance percentage be given most of the time, or
most of the time it would be given, or it may not be given. So for example, you know, maybe let's just say like they go, hey, there's only two isotopes, naturally occurring isotopes. One is, say, I'm just gonna make up the numbers, they're not correct, but let's just say it's carbon 12, and this guy occurs like 55% of the time, and there's carbon 13, you know, and then they give you the masses of these guys, like, hey, this guy is 12, AMU, this guy is 13, you know, AMU. And that's all they give you. And they really didn't give you the percentage of the other guy, right? But if you know that these are the only two isotopes that are present, 100%, right, would be the total of everybody. So you basically could subtract 55% from that, and you would know that the other isotope should be 45%. So I'll say most of the time you'll probably be given the percent abundances in the problem, but this is a common sort of problem that you sometimes come across where they might just give you the percentages of one or two isotopes and not the third, or one isotope and not the second one. And again, you could just assume that you have 100% of it, and you can find the missing percentage that way. And that's another common way that sometimes it occurs.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Now, it's important to remember that, you know, if you were able to kind of pull out like a carbon atom, you would never find one that really does have a mass of 12.01. You would either find one that has the mass of carbon 12, or you would find the one that has the mass of carbon 13. But again, we do use this as sort of the average atomic mass of those naturally occurring isotopes. So why don't you give one a go here? What is the average atomic mass of these two isotopes of bromine and the atomic masses of each isotope, and see what you come up with here. Getting to the end here, let's take a look at this one to see how we would do it. Again, we have basically two isotopes of bromine. We have the percentage of one and the percentage of the other. And again, if we just quickly take a peek at those two percentages, it's about 100%. So we know we're not missing any isotopes. And we obviously have the atomic masses of each of these isotopes. So we could use that formula where the atomic mass would be the first isotope, which was bromine 79. I'm going to convert the percentage into a decimal. So you could either, again, divide by 100 or just move the decimal point 2 places to the left. And that's what I'm going to do on this one. We will then times it by the atomic mass of the first isotope. We again will add here, not multiply. We're going to do the same thing for our second isotope here. And again, you can move the decimal point, or if you don't want to do that, you can also divide by 100% if you want. And then we're going to times that by 80.92, which is the atomic mass of the second isotope. And I believe you end up with 79.92 AMU. And I saw that in the chat box. So it looks like D is a winner there. Any questions on that? Okay, so I think it's a good stopping place. Made a pretty good dent, I think, into here.